Have you ever wondered how South Park stays fresh after 26 seasons? Unlike other adult animated comedies like Family Guy or The Simpsons, South Park isn't afraid to shake things up. Typically, cartoons like to keep the status quo, meaning it doesn't matter what happened in a previous episode, next week it's business as usual. The Belchers almost die in a terrible seaplane accident, no residual trauma. Homer quits his job to be an astronaut, back to the power plant on Monday, but South Park experiments. Whether it's the introduction of new characters, a change in environment, relationship development, or even telling an ongoing story, Matt Stone and Trey Parker regularly introduce new elements into the show in hopes to keep South Park interesting for both fans and themselves. It seems like every 2 or 3 seasons, some major event completely changes South Park. Some of the biggest changes include the boys progressing from the 3rd to 4th grade and the gentrification of South Park. Stan, Kenny, Kyle, and Cartman moving from the next grade was a major milestone. Not just for the boys, but for Matt and Trey as well, because it symbolizes their growth. This was South Park's 4th season. They already made a successful movie. These 2 young creators aren't the same people they were just a couple of years ago, and they wanted to personify this in the show. That's why South Park Season 4 just looks, feels, and sounds way different than earlier seasons in a good way. If they didn't take a risk to change up the show, it could have gotten real stale real fast. The world doesn't look the same as it did in 1997. That's why South Park completely revamped the town in 2005 to reflect the gentrification trend. The gentrification of South Park is something just not seen in other shows. The city of Springfield and Quahog look and feel the same since episode 1. Thanks to South Park's modern look, it's fit to tell more modern stories like the episode on Soto Sopa. But not all of South Park's changes are welcomed with open arms. Tegridy Farms, Randy's weed operation, was one of the more, if not most, controversial changes. Even if I didn't personally like the change, I respect the attempt. It took South Park to a completely new environment and allowed everyone's favorite talking towel to make a resurgence. Plus, we got to see the Marsh family dynamic evolve.
Shelly, we need to talk about your marijuana problem.
Stan, Sharon, and Shelley were already sick of Randy's antics, but his selfishness reached entirely new heights. Yes, Tegrity Farms was a low point for South Park, but it kept the show interesting. Not only is South Park willing to try new things, they are great at introducing new characters. With each episode, the intro gets more and more crowded with new faces. Every show introduces new characters, but South Park seems to be the only show where the new characters actually have a big impact. Other cartoons utilize celebrity guest stars or create a small character that are good for a gag or two, but none of them create a radical change like PC Principal. PC Principal replaced South Park's Principal Victoria in season 19. PC Principal was a response to this new change in society. He allowed South Park to both embrace PC culture and mock it simultaneously.
An African American flips a turtle over on its back. A transgender Filipino comes and sees the helpless turtle baking in the sun. What color is the Filipino's father?
And regardless how you personally feel about PC Principal, you can't deny the impact he's had on the show and the citizens of South Park. I mean, how many educators actually managed to put Cartman on edge? And I am just skimming the surface. South Park has introduced tons of iconic and memorable characters throughout the years, like Miss Chokes on Dick, Timmy, Jimmy, Mr. Slave, Harrison Yates the police detective, and more. But South Park doesn't need to introduce new characters to stay fresh, as it regularly updates older characters. I can't think of anyone with a more wild transformation than Mr. Garrison. From coming out to transitioning to a woman, then back into a man, to even becoming president of the United States. All of these wild transformations have allowed Mr. Garrison to play so many critical roles in episodes. He even becomes a highly regarded leader for the future in the epic Atheism 2-parter. Then there's Butters.
That's me!
Who graduated from near background character to a member of the main crew, all thanks to Matt Stone and Trey Parker's willingness to experiment. They killed off Kenny semi-permanently at the end of season 5, and they chose Butters to temporarily carry the torch. The Butters we all know and love would not exist if South Park didn't take a risk, and this risk paid off in spades as Butters quickly became a fan favorite. Imagine if The Simpsons decided to have Bart hang out with this weird-looking kid for a season or 2. They'd have another fully fleshed out character to play with instead of having another background character. And then we have Stan turning 10. Stan just never seemed the same again after turning 10. He became much more selfish, like when he almost got his friends killed ziplining for an iPod. Stan's newfound cynicism is great because it finally made a clear distinction between him and Kyle, who seemed way too similar up until this point. And before we get to probably the biggest character development in South Park, I want to give a shout out to everyone's favorite gay couple, Tweek and Craig. While South Park has had a bunch of homosexual relationships in the past, Tweek and Craig's is just so much more innocent and wholesome. Pairing up these two very different characters have produced a bunch of memorable moments. South Park doesn't do a lot of fan service, but when they do it right. But the South Park character whose growth I really want to talk about is Kenny. Kenny was pretty much a one-trick pony up until the Coon and Friends saga, where viewers finally learned how Kenny dies and returns time and time again. In cartoons, it's easy for viewers to suspend their disbelief. Matt Stone and Trey Parker didn't have to explain Kenny's multiple deaths, but doing so gave so much depth to his character. Knowing that Kenny is aware of his fate makes him much more of a tragic character, and he uses his power for good. There has been countless examples of Kenny's heroic sacrifices that have saved the day. I can see why Butters chose him to accompany him to Hawaii, and personally, I always tear up a bit when I see Mysterion save his little sister Karen. It's just one of the examples of South Park's ability to balance both humor and emotion. At its heart, South Park is a science fiction show, so Kenny gaining his powers through the occult both tracks and is satisfying. Imagine Family Guy giving a satisfying explanation why everyone is okay with a talking dog. And finally, one of my favorite things about South Park is how there's a much greater level of continuity compared to other cartoons. While South Park doesn't have a grand story arc like Dragon Ball Z, the writers love taking bits and pieces from previous episodes. Whether it's Mr. Garrison becoming a hermit after his romance novel was a gay bestseller, Wendy breaking up with Stan, or Randy being Lord, South Park has this sense of continuity. Other shows make callbacks to earlier episodes.
You went into outer space. You.
Sure. You've never been?
But South Park seems to be the only show where a lot of major events carry over. For example, I love how in South Park, deaths, except for Kenny's, is treated as a permanent thing. South Park even tried to do an entire season with an overarching plot, and they probably would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that meddling election year. We could spend hours analyzing every little change and event in South Park. South Park is one of the longest running TV shows because how often they break the mold.